Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Vocabulary, Character Traits and Emotion Words. This is A Tale of Three English Teachers. Once upon a time, there were three very different English teachers. They were very, very different. One was negative, one was charitable, and one was evil. The following slides tell the tales of these three teachers. Your job is to see if you can guess which teacher is negative, which is charitable, and which is evil. You'll also see if you can figure out words to describe them. Good luck! We're going to start with Mrs. Snavely's story. One day last spring, Mrs. Snavely was walking across campus. As she passed Memorial Hall, she saw a poor little puppy hobbling along. The sweet little thing's leg appeared to be broken, and the dog had a terrible limp. What did Mrs. Snavely do? She ran over to the puppy, pulled back her leg, and kicked the dog so hard it flew into the pond. Hurting a poor, injured puppy was a blank thing to do. Think, is this going to be a positive or a negative word? Vile. It was a vile thing to do. Vile means morally despicable or abhorrent, worthy of hate. In other words, really, really bad. Mrs. Snavely continued on her way. After a minute, she met a little girl named Kenya. Kenya asked Mrs. Snavely for a favor. She desperately needed a new toothbrush and asked Mrs. Snavely to go to the store for her. She handed Mrs. Snavely the only money she had, $5 she had gotten as a birthday gift. Mrs. Snavely took the money and went to the store, where she bought herself a Red Bull and M&Ms. Mrs. Snavely thought about poor little Kenya waiting to brush her teeth. Then she laughed for a full 5 minutes. Because Mrs. Snavely used Kenya's birthday money for herself, her behavior was positive or negative? Negative. It was depraved. That means corrupt, wicked, or perverted. She was corrupt because she took her money. The following day, fresh off her caffeine rush, Mrs. Snavely returned to school. Her class was filled with 10 boys and 10 girls. Mrs. Snavely only called on the boys and made fun of all the girls. While the boys all had A's, the girls were failing. She gave the boys cookies and candy, but spit in the girls' faces and threw their book bags in the trash. Mrs. Snavely did not like the girls, and was what we'd call what's a name for people who don't like women? It's misogynist. That means having hatred for women. Now we're going to Mr. Henson's story. When Mr. Henson heard the stories about Mrs. Snavely, he wasn't surprised. He said, "Of course Mrs. Snavely would do that. That's how people are. They're always selfish. They don't care about others. Humph." Mr. Henson always suspected the worst of people. You could say he was very cynical. Cynical means contemptuously distrustful of human nature and motives. You doubt the goodness of people. A little while later, Mrs. Duval came by. She offered Mrs. Snavely and Mr. Henson some homemade cookies. Mrs. Snavely grabbed 15 cookies and ran. Mr. Henson looked at the cookies, wrinkled his nose, and said, "What did you do to these? Did you poison them? Why are you giving them to me? Do you want something?" Mr. Henson did not trust Mrs. Duval. You could say he was something that means you don't trust people. Skeptical. Skeptical means having a distrustful and doubtful attitude. When Mrs. Snavely heard Mr. Henson didn't want his cookies, she said, "Would you mind if I could have them?" He looked at her with disgust and said, "Bring it." Mrs. Snavely just stared at him. "You want to go?" he asked. Then he pushed her. Mr. Henson seemed to be looking for a fight. You could say he was quarrelsome, or a synonym for quarrelsome. Argumentative. Prone to pick arguments and fights. Argumentative means prone to pick arguments and fights. Now we're on Mrs. Duval's story. Even though Mr. Henson didn't want the cookies she baked, it didn't dissuade Mrs. Duval from baking more cookies. She went home and made 14 dozen more cookies. The following day, she gave them all to her students, even the ones who said her vocab videos were boring. Everyone thought this was very thoughtful of her. Mrs. Duval was something thoughtful, benevolent, kind, good, giving. She gave the cookies. That was nice. So nice. After the cookies had been given out, Mrs. Duval went to the bank to cash her paycheck. As she walked home, she passed several people seeking donations for a homeless shelter. Mrs. Duval knew this was a good cause and wanted to help people, so she gave them her entire paycheck. Giving money to charity showed that Mrs. Duval was, think charity, philanthropic. It means charitable. Literally, it means a lover of people. Think about it. Philadelphia, city of love, philanthropic, lover of people. You might want to say that word aloud. Go ahead, no one's listening. Philanthropic. When Mrs. Duval got home, she found Mrs. Snavely and Mr. Henson waiting at her door. Both of their heaters had broken, and they needed a nice warm place to stay. Mrs. Duval welcomed them into her house, gave them dinner, and fluffed their pillows. Mrs. Duval was She took them in, she was kind, she was very hospitable. It means treating guests or strangers with kindness and generosity. Think about how that relates to the word hospital. To review, we have Mrs. Duval. She's benevolent, philanthropic, hospitable. We have Mrs. Snavely, who's vile, depraved, and misogynistic. Mr. Henson, cynical, skeptical, and argumentative. Which one of these people is charitable? Which one is evil? Which one is negative? Mrs. Duval is charitable, benevolent, philanthropic, hospitable. The evil one is Mrs. Snavely. She's vile, depraved, and misogynistic. And then we have Mr. Henson, who's negative because he's cynical, he's skeptical, and he's argumentative. And guess what? There were 3 typos in this presentation. You can get a do-over if you're one of the first 3 people to tell me what a typo is. Only 1 typo per person. Good luck.